Sarah Martinez pushed open the heavy glass doors of Thunder Ridge Gun Range. The loud crack of gunshots hit her ears immediately. She jumped a little at the sound. Her heart was beating fast as she looked around the busy shooting range. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Sarah had never smelled anything like it before. She clutched a piece of paper in her sweaty hands. It was the paperwork for renting a gun. Her co-workers at the public library had talked her into joining their monthly shooting group. They said it would be fun. Sarah was not so sure about that now. She was 28 years old and worked as a librarian in the city. Most days she helped children find picture books and showed elderly people how to use computers. Her life was quiet and peaceful. The loudest noise at work was when someone dropped a stack of books. This gun range was completely different from her normal world. Sarah wore safety glasses that were too big for her small face. The ear protection made everything sound muffled. She had borrowed all the safety gear from her friend Linda, who came here sometimes. Linda was much bigger than Sarah, so everything looked oversized on her tiny frame. The gun range was crowded with people on this Saturday morning. Most of them looked like they knew exactly what they were doing. They carried their own gun cases and talked about bullets and targets like Sarah talked about books and reading programs. These people belonged here. Sarah felt like she was visiting a foreign country where she did not speak the language. Near Lane 7 stood a group of men who were laughing loudly. The biggest man in the group was Jake Morrison. He was a construction worker with thick arms and a loud voice. Jake had been coming to Thunder Ridge Gun Range for 15 years. Everyone knew him here. He liked to tell stories about hunting trips and gun collections. His friends always listened and laughed at his jokes. Jake noticed Sarah right away. She looked nervous and out of place. Her borrowed safety gear was too big. She walked carefully, like she was afraid of everything around her. Jake nudged his friend Rick with his elbow. "Look at that," Jake whispered to Rick. "I bet she has never even seen a real gun before today." Rick looked over at Sarah and grinned. "She probably thinks guns work like they do in movies," he said quietly. The other men in their group turned to look at Sarah too. There was Tom, who owned a hardware store. There was Mike, who drove trucks for a living. There was Dave, who worked at the car repair shop. They all considered themselves real men who knew about real things like guns and hunting and fixing engines. $5 says she cannot hit anything, Rick said with a mean smile. $10 says she screams when the gun goes off, Mike added. The men chuckled among themselves. They had seen many beginners come and go. Most city people gave up after their first visit. They decided Sarah would probably be gone within an hour. Sarah heard some of their whispers but tried to ignore them. She was used to people thinking she was weak or helpless. In school, she had been the smallest kid in every class. Other children often picked on her because she was quiet and liked to read books instead of playing sports. Even now as an adult, people sometimes treated her like a child because she was small and soft-spoken. She walked up to the main counter where an older man was working. His name tag said Pete, and he looked like he had worked here for many years. Pete had gray hair and kind eyes. He had helped thousands of beginners learn to shoot safely over the years. "Good morning," Miss Pete said in a patient voice. "First time shooting?" Pete asked her. Sarah nodded and handed him the rental paperwork she had filled out online. Pete looked at her small hands and gentle face. He could tell she was nervous about being here. "No problem at all," Pete said kindly. "We will get you set up with something easy to handle." He reached under the counter and pulled out a basic pistol. It was not too big or too heavy. "This is a good gun for learning," he explained. "It will not kick too hard, and it is very safe." Pete spent several minutes explaining all the safety rules. He talked slowly and clearly like he was teaching a child. Sarah listened carefully to every word. She nodded at the right times and asked good questions. Pete was impressed that she was taking safety so seriously. Many beginners just wanted to start shooting right away. "Keep both hands on the gun at all times," Pete told her. "Never point it at anything you do not want to destroy. Always assume it is loaded even when you think it is empty." Sarah repeated the rules back to him to show she understood. Pete handed her a small box of bullets and pointed toward the lanes. "Lane 12 is open for you," he said. "That is at the far end away from the busy lanes. Take your time and remember everything I told you. If you have any problems, just wave and I will come help you." Sarah thanked Pete and walked toward lane 12. She could feel eyes watching her as she walked. The group of men near lane 7 had stopped talking to stare at her. She heard Jake say something about city girls who think they are tough. His friends laughed again. At lane 12, Sarah set down her box of bullets and looked at the gun in her hands. It felt heavier than she had expected. The metal was cold and smooth. Something strange happened when she held the gun. For just a moment it felt familiar, like she had held one before. But that was impossible. She had never even touched a toy gun as a child. Sarah shook her head and tried to focus. She was probably just nervous and imagining things. She looked down the lane at the paper target hanging 25 yards away. It looked very far away. The center circle looked tiny from where she stood. Behind her, she could hear Jake making jokes about beginners who come to gun ranges. He was telling his friends about a woman who had cried after firing one shot last month. Everyone thought that was very funny. Sarah tried not to listen, but their voices were loud and mean. She took a deep breath and tried to remember everything. Pete had taught her about loading the gun safely. Her hands moved more smoothly than she expected. The bullets slid into the magazine easily. She inserted the magazine into the gun with a solid click. Something felt right about these movements. Her fingers seemed to know what to do, even though her mind did not understand why. Sarah looked at the target again and raised the gun. She did not know that her stance was perfect or that her grip was exactly right. She just did what felt natural. The men behind her had gotten quieter. Even Jake had stopped telling jokes. Something about the way Sarah held the gun looked different from other beginners. She was not shaking or fumbling around. She looked calm and focused. Sarah took another deep breath and prepared to fire her first shot. She had no idea that her life was about to change forever. She did not know that the skills sleeping deep in her mind were about to wake up. All she knew was that holding this gun felt like coming home to a place she had never been before. Sarah stood in lane 12 with the loaded gun in her hands. She could feel the weight of it pulling down on her arms. The target at the end of the lane looked so small and far away. 25 yards seemed like an impossible distance to hit anything accurately. She raised the pistol toward the target and tried to remember what Pete had told her about aiming. Line up the front sight with the back sight. Focus on the front sight, not the target. Squeeze the trigger slowly and smoothly. Do not jerk or pull it fast. What Sarah did not realize was that her stance was perfect. Her feet were exactly the right distance apart. Her stronger foot was positioned slightly behind the other one for better balance. Both hands gripped the gun firmly, but not too tight. These were things that took most people months of practice to learn correctly. Pete watched from behind the main counter. He had helped thousands of beginners over the years. Most new shooters stood wrong or held the gun wrong or forgot half the safety rules he had just taught them. But Sarah looked like she had been shooting for years. Her form was better than some of the regular customers who came here every week. Sarah took a deep breath and slowly squeezed the trigger. The gun fired with a loud bang that echoed through the range. The recoil pushed her hands up, but she controlled it easily. Most beginners were surprised by how loud guns were or how much they kicked. Sarah seemed ready for both. Something very strange happened when the gun fired. Sarah felt a weird sense of memory wash over her mind. The sound of the gunshot felt familiar. The smell of the burning gunpowder reminded her of something she could not quite remember. The feeling of the recoil against her hands was like greeting an old friend. She looked through the small telescope that let shooters see their targets clearly. Her first bullet had hit just outside the center ring. For a complete beginner, that was an excellent shot. Most new shooters missed the target completely on their first try. Sarah frowned at the bullet hole. She knew she could do better even, though she did not know how she knew that. Behind her, the group of men had stopped talking completely. They were all watching Sarah now. Jake had been telling a story about a hunting trip, but his words died in his throat when he heard Sarah's shot. He looked toward her target through his own telescope. That was just lucky, Jake muttered to his friends. Watch her next few shots go wild. Nobody shoots that well on their first day. Rick nodded in agreement. Beginners always got worse after the first shot because they got scared of the noise and recoil. Sarah loaded another bullet into the chamber and aimed again. Her movements were smooth and confident. She did not fumble with the gun or drop the ammunition like most beginners did. Her hands seemed to know exactly what to do without her brain having to think about it. The second shot rang out across the range. Sarah felt that same strange feeling of familiarity again. Images flashed through her mind for just a split second. She saw herself holding different guns in different places. The images were gone before she could focus on them, but they left her feeling confused and curious. She looked through the telescope at her target. The second bullet had hit even closer to the center than the first one. Sarah smiled without realizing. Its shooting felt good in a way she could not explain. It felt right and natural, like she was doing something she was meant to do. Pete walked over from the counter to get a closer look at what was happening in lane 12. He had noticed that Sarah's shots sounded different from typical beginner shots. They were coming at steady intervals instead of the nervous random timing that most new shooters used. "Ma'am," Pete said politely. "May I take a look at your target?" Sarah nodded and stepped aside. Pete raised his own telescope and studied the paper target hanging at the end of the lane. His eyebrows went up in surprise. Both shots were in the center area of the target, and they were very close together. "Are you absolutely sure you have never done this before?" Pete asked her carefully. Sarah looked at him with honest confusion in her eyes. "I have never touched a gun in my life," she said. "I work at the public library helping people find books. I have never been hunting or taken any shooting lessons or anything like that." Pete studied her face for signs that she was lying. He had seen people try to hustle money from other shooters by pretending to be beginners. But Sarah seemed genuinely puzzled by her own accuracy. Her confusion looked completely real. Sarah continued, shooting while Pete watched. Each bullet hit closer to the center than the last one. Her grouping of shots kept getting tighter and tighter. By her 7th shot, she was hitting the center ring every time. By her 10th shot, she was hitting the very middle of the center ring, consistently. Jake was no longer making jokes or telling stories. He had stopped shooting his own gun completely and was staring at Sarah's target in disbelief. 15 years of shooting experience had taught him what was normal for beginners and what was not. This was definitely not normal. Rick walked over to Jake's lane and whispered urgently, "Look at her target, man. Those shots are grouped tighter than mine, and I have been shooting for 10 years. Jake nodded grimly. Either she is lying about being a beginner or something very weird is going on here. The other men in their group had noticed too. Tom stopped cleaning his gun to watch Sarah shoot. Mike and Dave moved closer to get a better view of her target. Word was starting to spread to other lanes that something unusual was happening in lane 12. Sarah was completely focused on shooting and did not notice all the attention she was getting. Each time she pulled the trigger, she felt more of those strange flashes of memory. She saw herself in places that looked like they were not on Earth. She saw herself holding weapons that looked more advanced than regular guns. She saw herself protecting groups of people from dangers she could not identify. The memories were confusing because they felt completely real, but she knew they could not be. Sarah had lived a quiet, normal life in the city. She had never been in the military or learned to fight or traveled to strange places. She was just a librarian who helped people find books and use computers. But her hands kept moving like they had done this thousands of times before. Her aim kept getting better with each shot instead of worse like most beginners. Her breathing and timing were perfect. Her stance never wavered. Everything about her shooting was wrong for someone who had never held a gun before. Pete called out to the other employees behind the counter. "Hey guys, come take a look at this. You need to see what this lady is doing in lane 12. It is the most amazing beginner shooting I have ever seen in 30 years of running this place." More people began gathering behind Sarah's shooting position. Regular customers stopped their own shooting to watch. Even some people from the gun store next door heard about what was happening and came over to see for themselves. Sarah finally noticed all the people watching her when she paused to reload. She turned around and saw at least 15 people standing behind her lane. Their faces showed amazement and confusion and suspicion. She felt her cheeks turn red with embarrassment. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "Am I doing something wrong?" Pete shook his head with wonder. "You are doing everything right, ma'am. Too right for someone who claims to have never shot before. Would you mind if we moved you back to a longer distance? I want to see what you can do at 50 yards. Sarah agreed. Even though she did not understand why everyone was so interested in her shooting, Pete changed her target to one that was 50 yards away instead of 25. The target looked even smaller now. Sarah raised her gun and aimed carefully. She felt completely calm and confident, even though she knew she should be nervous about the longer distance. Her first shot at 50 yards hit the center ring. Her second shot hit right next to the first one. The crowd behind her began murmuring in amazement. Jake looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. This was impossible, and he knew it. The crowd behind Sarah kept growing bigger. People from all over the gun range had stopped what they were doing to watch her shoot. Even customers from the gun store next door were walking over to see what was causing all the excitement. Everyone was talking quietly among themselves about the small woman who was shooting better than anyone had ever seen. Sarah felt uncomfortable with all the attention. She was used to being invisible at the library where she worked quietly in the background, helping people find books. Having 15 strangers staring at her every move made her nervous. But when she held the gun and looked down the range at the target, all her nervousness went away. Pete moved her target back to 75 yards. This was a distance that challenged even experienced shooters. The target looked tiny from where Sarah stood. Most people needed special scopes or very expensive guns to shoot accurately at this distance. Sarah was using a basic rental pistol that cost less than $200. She raised the gun and aimed carefully. The strange flashes of memory were getting stronger now. She saw herself in what looked like a military uniform, but not from any army she recognized. She saw herself teaching other people how to shoot in places that did not look like Earth. She saw herself using weapons that looked far more advanced than anything that existed today. Sarah fired 5 shots in a row at the 75-yard target. Each shot hit the center ring. The crowd behind her went completely silent. Even Pete was shaking his head in disbelief. In 30 years of running the gun range, he had never seen anything like this from anyone, let alone a complete beginner. Jake Morrison could not stand it anymore. His pride was hurt badly. He had won the monthly shooting competition at Thunder Ridge 3 times this year. Everyone at the range looked up to him as one of the best shooters. Watching this tiny librarian make him look like an amateur was more than his ego could handle. Jake pushed through the crowd and walked right up to Sarah's shooting lane. His face was red with anger and embarrassment. His friends Rick and Tom followed behind him, looking worried. They knew Jake had a bad temper when things did not go his way. Little Lady Jake said in a loud voice that everyone could hear, "I think you are playing games with us. Nobody shoots like that on their first day, nobody. You must have been shooting for years and you are just pretending to be a beginner for some reason." Sarah turned to face Jake. He was much bigger than her and looked very angry. She could see the frustration in his eyes. Other people had doubted her before in different situations. Teachers who thought she was too quiet to be smart. Bosses who thought she was too small to handle difficult customers. She was used to people not believing in her abilities. "I am not pretending about anything," Sarah said quietly but firmly. "I have never held a gun before today. I work at the public library on Main Street. You can call them and ask if you want. I help children find picture books and teach elderly people how to use computers. That is my whole life." Jake did not believe her for a second. Her shooting was too perfect and too consistent. No beginner in the history of shooting had ever performed like this. He was convinced she was some kind of professional shooter trying to make fools out of them. "How about we make this interesting?" Jake announced loudly so everyone could hear. "You and me head to head. A real shooting contest. Best score out of 10 shots at 100 yards. Winner takes $50 from the loser." The crowd murmured with excitement. 100 yards was serious distance shooting that required years of training and experience. It was the kind of challenge that separated real shooters from pretenders. Rick grabbed Jake's arm and tried to talk him out of it. "Jake, this is crazy," Rick whispered urgently. "She just shot better at 75 yards. Than you do at 50 yards. You are going to lose your money and look like an idiot." But Jake shook him off angrily. He was too proud to back down now in front of all these people. Tom and Mike also tried to convince Jake to forget about the challenge. They could see that something very unusual was happening with Sarah's shooting, but Jake refused to listen to any of them. His reputation as the best shooter at Thunder Ridge was on the line. Sarah looked around at all the faces staring at her. She could see curiosity and doubt and excitement in their eyes. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. Next, she did not want to take Jake's money, but she also did not want him to keep calling her a liar. "I do not want to take your money," Sarah said softly. "But if it will prove that I am telling the truth about being new to this, then I will accept your challenge." Jake grinned widely, thinking he was about to embarrass this pretender in front of everyone. Pete walked over looking concerned. "Folks," he said carefully, 100 yards is very long-distance shooting. It requires a lot of skill and experience. Maybe we should start with something shorter." But Jake cut him off rudely. "The little lady says she can shoot Pete. Let her prove it. Set up the targets at 100 yards and make it official." Pete sighed and shook his head, but he went to prepare the challenge. Word spread quickly through the gun range and the gun store about the shooting contest that was about to happen. More people came over to watch. Some of the regular customers started making bets on who would win. Most of them bet on Jake because he was known as an excellent shooter, but a few people who had been watching Sarah shoot were not so sure. Her accuracy at shorter distances had been beyond anything they had ever seen. An elderly man named Colonel Hayes, who came to the range every Saturday morning, was studying Sarah carefully. He had been a military officer for 30 years and had seen the best shooters in the world. What Sarah was doing reminded him of something, but he could not quite figure out what. Sarah felt a strange calmness come over her as Pete set up the 100-yard targets. The voice in her head that she could not identify was whispering that she could make this shot easily, that she had made much harder shots than this many times before. The memories or visions were becoming clearer now. She saw herself on what looked like a space station protecting human colonists from alien attackers. She saw herself on desert planets where the gravity was different from Earth. She saw herself training groups of soldiers to fight battles among the stars. None of it made any sense, but all of it felt completely real. Jake was stretching his arms and adjusting his shooting glasses. He had brought his own custom pistol from his car. It was an expensive gun that he had spent thousands of dollars modifying for accuracy. He was confident that his experience and equipment would give him a big advantage over Sarah and her cheap rental gun. The crowd formed a semicircle behind the shooting positions. Pete explained the rules clearly. Each shooter would fire 10 shots at the 100-yard target. The person with the highest combined score would win. There would be no practice shots or warm-up rounds. Jake would shoot first because he had issued the challenge. He loaded his magazine carefully with his best ammunition. These were special bullets that cost $5 each and were designed for maximum accuracy. He had been saving them for the monthly competition, but decided to use them now to make sure he won. Sarah stood quietly beside her shooting position, holding the basic rental pistol. She looked calm and relaxed while Jake was obviously nervous, now that the moment had arrived. The crowd was completely silent, waiting to see what would happen. Pete raised his hand to signal that the contest was about to begin. Jake took his position and aimed down range at the tiny target 100 yards away. His hands were shaking slightly from nerves and anger. He had talked himself into a situation where he could not afford to lose. Sarah watched Jake prepare to shoot and felt sorry for him. She did not understand where her shooting ability was coming from, but she knew it was real. The voice in her head was telling her that this contest would not even be close. She was going to win easily, and Jake was going to be humiliated in front of everyone. But Sarah did not want to hurt Jake's feelings or make him look bad. She just wanted to prove that she was telling the truth about being a beginner. She had no idea that what was about to happen would change her life forever and reveal secrets about herself that she never could have imagined. Pete gave the signal and Jake stepped up to the firing line. The 100-yard target looked impossibly small from where he stood. Jake had been shooting for 15 years, but he still found this distance challenging even with his expensive custom pistol and special ammunition. Jake tried to control his breathing and steady his hands. The pressure of having so many people watching was getting to him. His usual confidence was shaken by what he had seen Sarah do at shorter distances. But he told himself that 100 yards was different. This was where experience and training really mattered. His first shot rang out across the range. Jake looked through his scope and saw that he had hit the target but not in the center ring. The bullet was in the second ring, which was still a good shot for most people, but not what Jake had hoped for. He tried to push down his frustration and focus on his next shot. Jake's second shot was better and hit closer to the center. His third shot was also good. As he continued shooting, Jake found his rhythm and his shots improved. His expensive gun and ammunition were helping him achieve decent accuracy, but he was still not shooting as well as he normally did because of the pressure and nerves. The crowd watched silently as Jake fired all 10 of his shots. When he finished, Pete walked down range to check his target. Jake had shot well enough to beat any normal beginner. His 10 shots were grouped reasonably close together, with most of them hitting the center area of the target. Pete announced Jake's score to the crowd. It was a respectable score that would have won most amateur competitions. Jake felt a little better about his performance. He was confident that no real beginner could beat what he had just done at 100 yards. Now it was Sarah's turn. She stepped up to the firing line holding the basic rental pistol that cost less than Jake's ammunition. The crowd was completely silent as they waited to see what would happen. Everyone was curious whether her amazing shooting at shorter distances would continue at this much longer range. Sarah raised the pistol and looked down range at the tiny target. Something extraordinary began happening in her mind. The flashes of memory that had been coming and going all morning suddenly became much stronger and clearer. It was like someone had turned up the volume on a television that had been playing quietly in the background. She saw herself standing on the bridge of a spaceship that was under attack. Enemy ships were firing at them from impossible distances. Sarah was returning fire with weapons that could hit targets across miles of space. Her shots were guided by computers, but her instincts told her exactly where to aim. She saw herself training new recruits on a military base that was not on Earth. The gravity was lighter and the air was thinner, but she adapted her shooting technique perfectly. She could hit targets that other instructors said were impossible to reach. Her students called her the best marksman in the galaxy. She saw herself defending human colonies on planets where the weather was always changing. She could calculate wind speed and atmospheric pressure in her head and adjust her aim accordingly. She never missed when human lives were depending on her accuracy. All of these visions felt completely real to Sarah, even though she knew they were impossible. She was just a librarian from the city who had never left the state, let alone traveled to other planets. But her hands and her eyes and her instincts were telling her that these memories were true. Sarah fired her first shot at the 100-yard target. The bullet hit dead center in the middle of the bullseye. The crowd gasped in amazement. Even at this extreme distance, her accuracy was perfect. Jake's face went pale as he realized what was happening. Sarah's second shot hit so close to the first, one that the bullet holes almost touched each other. Her third shot hit in the exact same area. By her fourth shot, the crowd had gone completely silent. They were watching something that defied every rule of shooting they had ever learned. The visions in Sarah's mind were becoming more vivid with each shot. She saw herself as a protector of humanity, fighting battles across the galaxy. She saw herself using skills and knowledge that no human should possess. She saw herself as someone completely different from the quiet librarian she had always been. Sarah fired her fifth shot and it hit in the same impossible cluster as the previous four. Jake was staring at her target through binoculars and his hands were shaking. This level of accuracy was beyond anything he had ever seen, even from professional shooters and military snipers. The sixth shot hit the same spot. The seventh shot also hit the center. Rick was standing next to Jake and whispered, "This is not possible, man. No human being can shoot like this." "Nobody." Jake nodded numbly because he could not argue with what his eyes were seeing. Colonel Hayes was watching from the back of the crowd with growing recognition in his eyes. He had seen extraordinary shooting before during his military career, but never anything like this. Sarah's performance reminded him of classified reports he had read about soldiers who seemed to remember skills they had never learned. Sarah fired her eighth shot and felt the visions becoming overwhelming. She saw herself leading teams of human soldiers against alien invaders. She saw herself making impossible shots to save entire cities of people. She saw herself as a hero and a warrior instead of a quiet librarian. Her ninth shot hit the same tiny cluster as all the others. The crowd was stunned into complete silence. Even Pete, who had seen everything in 30 years of running a gun range, was speechless. This was beyond skill or training or natural talent. This was something else entirely. Sarah aimed for her final shot and saw one last vision that was clearer than all the others. She saw herself standing in a place that looked like mission control for a space program. She was wearing a uniform she did not recognize and holding a weapon that had not been invented yet. A voice was telling her that the fate of humanity depended on her next shot. Sarah fired her 10th and final shot. It hit in the exact center of the cluster she had created with her previous 9 shots. All 10 bullets had hit within a circle, smaller than a quarter at 100 yards. The silence from the crowd was so complete that the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning system. Pete walked down range to score Sarah's target with hands that were shaking slightly. When he returned, he held up the target for everyone to see. The crowd stared in disbelief at the impossible cluster of bullet holes in the exact center of the bullseye. Jake looked like someone had told him that gravity had stopped working. His 15 years of shooting experience meant nothing compared to what he had just witnessed. This was not beginner's luck or natural talent. This was something that should not have been possible for any human being. Sarah lowered the pistol and felt dizzy for a moment. The visions that had been so clear during the shooting were already starting to fade like a dream after waking up. She looked around at all the shocked faces staring at her and realized she had just done something that would change her life forever. Pete walked back from the target range holding Sarah's target in his trembling hands. The crowd gathered around him as he held it up for everyone to see clearly. The 10 bullet holes were clustered together in a space smaller than a silver dollar. At 100 yards, this kind of accuracy was beyond what any human should be able to achieve. The silence stretched on for several long seconds as everyone tried to process what they were looking at. Finally, Jake spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "This is impossible," he said. "Nobody shoots like this. Not Olympic champions, not military snipers, not anyone." Jake was right, and everyone knew it. The best professional shooters in the world would be proud to achieve this level of accuracy with the most expensive equipment available. Sarah had done it with a basic rental gun that cost less than $200 and ammunition that came from a bulk box. Tom and Mike were standing next to Jake looking stunned. They had known Jake for years and considered him one of the best shooters they had ever met. Watching him get completely outclassed by a small librarian who claimed to have never held a gun before was shocking beyond belief. The crowd began talking among themselves in hushed voices. Theories started flying about who Sarah really was and where she had learned to shoot like this. Some people suggested she was an undercover federal agent testing their security. Others wondered if she was a professional competitor playing an elaborate prank. A few people thought she might be some kind of military special operations soldier who was pretending to be a civilian. The most wild theory was that she was part of some secret government program that created super soldiers. But none of these explanations seemed to fit the quiet, confused woman standing in lane 12. Sarah herself was the most confused person there. She stared at her own target, trying to understand how she had achieved such incredible precision. The visions that had come during the shooting were already fading from her memory like dreams after waking up. All she could remember was feeling completely confident and natural while shooting. Colonel Hayes pushed through the crowd and walked up to Sarah. He was a tall, elderly man with gray hair and kind but serious eyes. His military bearing was obvious, even though he was wearing civilian clothes. People at the range knew he had been a high-ranking officer, but he rarely talked about his service. "Ma'am," the colonel said in his deep, gravelly voice, "may I have a word with you?" Sarah nodded because something about his calm presence made her feel less confused and frightened. The colonel gestured toward a quiet corner away from the crowd. Pete also approached them looking concerned and curious. "Folks," he said to the crowd, "I think we need to give the lady some space. This has been an unusual day for everyone. Why don't we let her process what just happened?" The crowd reluctantly began to disperse, but many people stayed nearby, hoping to overhear the conversation. The colonel studied Sarah's face carefully with the experienced eye of someone who had interrogated prisoners and evaluated soldiers for special assignments. He was looking for signs of deception or hidden training, but all he saw was genuine confusion and surprise. "Young lady," the colonel said quietly, "I need to ask you one more time. Are you absolutely certain you have never fired a weapon before today? Sarah met his gaze steadily and nodded. Sir, I give you my word that I have never touched a gun in my life until this morning. The colonel believed her. His years of military experience had taught him to recognize truth and lies. Sarah was not acting or pretending. Her confusion about her own abilities was completely genuine. But that made what had just happened even more mysterious and concerning. Work at the public library on Main Street, Sarah continued. I help children find picture books and teach senior citizens how to use computers. I have never been in the military or taken shooting lessons or done anything like this before. But when I hold the gun, everything feels familiar somehow. The colonel nodded thoughtfully. He had seen similar cases before, but not often, and never this dramatic. Tell me about your dreams, he said gently. Have you been having any unusual dreams? Lately, especially about fighting or weapons or places that seem strange but familiar. Sarah looked startled that he had asked about her dreams. How did you know, she asked. Because I have seen this before, the colonel replied, though not often and never to this degree. Usually it happens with veterans who are starting to remember things they thought they had forgotten. But your case is different. Sarah described her recent dreams in detail. She told him about the visions of herself in military uniforms she did not recognize. She explained the dreams about protecting human settlements on planets that were not Earth. She talked about the battles against enemies that did not look human, and weapons that were far more advanced than anything that existed today. The colonel listened carefully to every word. His expression grew more serious with each detail Sarah provided. These were not normal dreams or random fantasies. They had the structure and consistency of actual memories. But memories of what and from where? Pete had been listening quietly from nearby. He had heard stories over the years about people who seemed to have skills they had never learned. Usually these stories came from old-timers who claimed to have seen impossible things during their military service. Pete had always assumed these were just tall tales, but now he was not so sure. What if I told you, the colonel said slowly, that those might not be dreams? What if they are memories from another version of yourself living in a different reality? Sarah laughed nervously. That sounds like something from a science fiction movie, she said. But even as she said it, Sarah felt a deep certainty that the colonel was telling the truth. The dreams had always felt more real than regular dreams. They had details and consistency that normal dreams never possessed. They felt like memories of a life she had actually lived somewhere else. The colonel explained that there were theories that went far beyond what the general public knew about consciousness and memory. In rare cases, skills and knowledge could somehow transfer between different versions of the same person existing in parallel realities. The military had studied such cases, but the research was highly classified. Most people who experienced this phenomenon were soldiers who seemed to remember battles they had never fought or skills they had never learned. The government was very interested in understanding how this worked, but the cases were extremely rare. Sarah's case was the most dramatic example the colonel had ever encountered. Think about it, the colonel said. The Sarah Martinez standing here is a librarian who had never fired a gun before today. But somewhere else in another reality, another version of you spent years protecting human colonies across the galaxy. Today, for reasons we do not understand, those two versions of yourself briefly merged. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as the explanation resonated with everything she had experienced. It explained the familiar feeling of holding the gun and the perfect accuracy that had surprised even her. It explained the visions of places and battles that felt like memories instead of imagination. Jake appeared near their group looking humble and embarrassed. He had been listening to parts of their conversation, and his anger had been replaced by curiosity and respect. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I came to apologize for doubting you and for being rude. I have never seen anything like what you did today." Jake continued, "I also wanted to ask if you would consider joining our shooting group. We meet here every Saturday morning, and we could all learn from someone with your abilities. Whatever is happening with your shooting, we would be honored to have you as part of our team." Sarah smiled at Jake's change in attitude. She could see that his pride had been replaced by genuine amazement and respect. The other men in his group were also looking at her differently now. Instead of mockery, she saw curiosity and admiration in their faces. Colonel Hayes put his hand on Sarah's shoulder, in a fatherly way. "Young lady," he said, "I think you need to understand that what happened here today was just the beginning. Those memories and skills are part of you now, and they are not going away. You have a choice to make about what you want to do with these abilities." Sarah looked around the gun range that had become the place where her life changed forever. The quiet librarian who had walked in that morning no longer existed. She had been replaced by someone with skills and memories that defied explanation. Sarah did not know what the future would hold, but she knew it would be very different from her past. As the crowd began to leave the gun range, most people were still talking quietly about what they had witnessed. Many of them would remember this day for the rest of their lives, as the time they saw something impossible happen right in front of their eyes. But Sarah found herself alone with Colonel Hayes and Pete in the small office behind the main counter. The office was quiet and private, with awards and certificates covering the walls. Pete had won many shooting competitions over the years and had certificates from training courses he had taken, but none of his achievements seemed impressive anymore compared to what Sarah had just done with no training at all. "Tell me more about these dreams," Sarah the Colonel said gently. "I need to understand exactly what you are seeing and feeling. The more details you can remember, the better I can help you figure out what is happening to you." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to recall the visions that had been so clear while she was shooting. The memories were already becoming fuzzy, like trying to remember a dream from several days ago. But some details were still sharp and clear in her mind. "I see myself in places that definitely are not on Earth," she began slowly. "The sky is a different color and there are multiple moons visible during the day. I am wearing a uniform that looks military, but not like any military I have ever seen. The fabric seems to be made from materials that do not exist yet." She continued describing her visions while the Colonel listened carefully. "I am always carrying weapons, but they look much more advanced than regular guns. They fire beams of light instead of bullets, and they never seem to run out of ammunition. I know how to use them perfectly, even though I have never seen anything like them before." The most clear memory Sarah had was of herself, standing on what looked like the command deck of a massive spaceship. She was giving orders to other soldiers, who treated her with great respect. They called her Commander Martinez and seemed to trust her completely with their lives. "In these visions, I am protecting groups of human settlers on planets that are being colonized," Sarah explained. "There are always threats from alien species that do not want humans to spread across the galaxy. I am part of some kind of military force that keeps the colonies safe from attack." Colonel Hayes nodded as Sarah spoke. Her descriptions matched classified reports he had read during his military career about theoretical future conflicts and space colonization. The government had war-gamed scenarios about defending human settlements on other worlds, even though such technology was still decades away. What Sarah was describing sounded like memories from a future version of humanity that had achieved interstellar travel and was expanding across the galaxy. But somehow those memories were finding their way into the mind of a present-day librarian who had never left her home state. The Colonel had a theory about what was happening, but he was not sure if Sarah was ready to hear it. The government had been studying cases like this for years under programs so secret that most military officers never heard about them. The research suggested that consciousness was not limited to a single timeline or reality. Sarah the Colonel said carefully, "What I am about to tell you will sound impossible, but I believe it explains what you experience today. There are theories that suggest every person exists in multiple realities simultaneously. Most of the time, these different versions of ourselves live completely separate lives." He continued explaining the concept while Pete listened with growing amazement. "But sometimes, in very rare cases, the barriers between these parallel versions of reality become thin. When that happens, memories and skills can bleed through from one version of a person to another. Usually this only happens in small ways that people dismiss as intuition or lucky guesses. Your case is extraordinary because the transfer of memories and abilities is so complete and dramatic," the Colonel said. "The version of you that exists in our reality is a librarian, but there is another version of you in a different timeline where humanity has spread across the stars and you are a military commander protecting human colonies." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as the colonel's explanation made perfect sense of everything she had experienced. It explained why holding the gun had felt so familiar and why her shooting had been impossibly accurate. It explained the visions of alien worlds and advanced weapons that had felt like real memories. "But why is this happening to me?" Sarah asked. "Why now, and why so dramatically?" The colonel admitted that science did not have complete answers to those questions. Some researchers believed that moments of high stress or strong emotion could trigger these transfers between parallel selves. Others thought that certain people were naturally more sensitive to connections between different realities. There might be something unique about Sarah's brain chemistry or consciousness that made her more likely to receive memories from her alternate self. Pete had been listening to this conversation with his mouth hanging open. In 30 years of running a gun range, he thought he had seen everything. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. He was a practical man who believed in things he could see and touch, but the evidence of what Sarah had done was undeniable. "Ma'am," Pete said to Sarah, "I do not pretend to understand what the colonel is talking about with parallel realities and such. But I know what I saw today, and it was not humanly possible. Whatever is happening to you, I want you to know that you are welcome here any time. This range could use someone with your abilities." Sarah smiled at Pete's practical acceptance of the impossible. She was beginning to understand that her life had changed in ways that could never be reversed. The quiet librarian she had been that morning was gone forever. She had been replaced by someone with skills and memories that came from among the stars. Colonel Hayes stood up and handed Sarah a business card with only a phone number printed on it. "If you decide you want to explore these abilities further," he said, "call this number. There are people who can help you understand what you are experiencing and perhaps teach you to control it better." Sarah looked at the card and felt another flash of memory from her other self. She saw herself working with teams of scientists and soldiers to develop new weapons and tactics for defending humanity. She saw herself as a leader and protector, rather than someone who spent her days organizing books and helping people use computers. The colonel continued his explanation. "The skills and memories you access today are just the beginning, Sarah. As the connection between your parallel selves grows stronger, you may find yourself knowing things you have never learned, and being able to do things you have never practiced. This could be a great gift or a great responsibility depending on how you choose to use it." Sarah realized that she had to make a choice about what kind of person she wanted to become. She could try to ignore what had happened and go back to her quiet life at the library. But she knew the memories and abilities would not go away. They were part of her now, whether she wanted them or not. Or she could embrace this new version of herself and explore the possibilities that came with having the skills of an elite warrior from another reality. She could learn to use these abilities to protect people and make a difference in ways she had never imagined possible. Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway of the office looking nervous but determined. "Ma'am," he said to Sarah, "I know I was rude to you earlier and I apologize for that, but I wanted to ask you something important. Would you consider teaching some of us how to shoot the way you do? We could all learn from someone with your level of skill." Sarah looked at Jake and his friends who had gathered behind him. These men who had mocked her just hours ago were now looking at her with respect and admiration. They wanted to learn from her instead of dismissing her as a helpless beginner. "I would be happy to try," Sarah said, "though I am not sure I can teach something that I do not fully understand myself. But if my abilities can help other people become better at protecting themselves and their families, then I think I should share what I know." As Sarah left Thunder Ridge Gun Range that afternoon, she carried with her the understanding that she was no longer just a librarian from the city. She was someone with a connection to abilities and knowledge that came from protecting humanity across the galaxy. The dreams were becoming clearer and the memories were becoming stronger. Sarah knew that her quiet life was over and that adventures she could barely imagine were waiting for her. She had found her true calling and discovered that she was meant for something far greater than organizing books and teaching people to use computers. She was a guardian and a protector whose time had finally come.